Welcome to class, everyone. Go ahead and grab a seat. I'm going to be your professor today as we unpack what is arguably one of the most complex, highly sensitive historical subjects we can study, the history of slavery within Islamic societies. Over the course of this explainer, we're going to dive into the work of scholar Jonathan A.C. Brown. We'll be looking specifically at his really incredible research into how Islamic law originally envisioned servitude, how it was actually practiced on the ground, and the massive moral conundrum it presents to us today. Okay, let's just dive right in. Before we get into the heavy historical analysis, I want you to consider this quote. I know it when I see it. This was actually a famous legal rule proposed by Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart for defining hardcore pornography. He was essentially trying to define the indefinable. And you know what's really interesting? As historians, we run into the exact same problem with the word slavery. Because as you'll see today, clearly defining what slavery actually means across centuries, cultures, and entirely different continents is surprisingly difficult. All right, so here is our syllabus for today's explainer. First, we'll tackle the problem of definition. Second, we'll look at the ideals of the shariah. Third, we'll map out the lived historical reality. Fourth, we'll trace the road to abolition. And finally, we will confront the modern conundrum. Okay, moving right into section 1, the problem of definition. So modern academic criticism really challenges us to stop projecting our own Atlantic-centric definitions of slavery onto the distant past. Now, you might be wondering, why are we talking about this today? Well, because this isn't just some dusty, ancient topic that only lives in textbooks. Slavery absolutely dominates our modern media, our pop culture, and global politics. I mean, think about Kanye West's controversial comments about American slavery, or the massive debates over removing historical statues. You even see it as a central theme in popular movies like Solo or Sorry to Bother You. And on a much, much darker note, we've literally seen extremist groups like ISIS try to justify absolutely abhorrent practices by claiming they're just reviving historical Islamic laws. This proves exactly why establishing a neutral, academic understanding of this history is absolutely crucial. We just can't let modern rhetoric cloud our historical investigation. And this brings us to a brilliant analogy that illustrates our first major hurdle, which is definition. Trying to pinpoint a single, transhistorical definition of slavery is kind of like classifying a tomato. Scientifically, right, in an abstract taxonomy, a tomato is a fruit. It has seeds, it develops from the ovary of a flower, the whole shebang. But culturally, in our everyday reality, we all treat the tomato as a vegetable. We put it in salads, definitely not fruit salads. We naturally categorize things based on familiar cultural analogies rather than abstract scientific perfection. When we look at history, we often group incredibly diverse forms of human dependency and labor under the single label of slavery, simply because they culturally look like the Atlantic slavery we're so familiar with. All right, that brings us to section 2, ideals of the shariah. To really grasp this, we have to move chronologically back to the origins of Islamic law. The absolute crucial point here is understanding the concept of riqq. This is the system of slavery in Islamic law. But here is where we have to totally separate our modern assumptions from historical legal theory. In the Sharia, the foundational agreed-upon principle was actually that the natural default state of all humans is freedom. Riqq was conceptualized primarily as a legal handicap. It was seen as a weakness. It was a status that essentially dropped an individual below their free counterparts in certain very specific legal areas, like the capacity to give witness in a court or to own independent property. It was not originally defined as this absolute, dehumanizing domination. As detailed by Jonathan A.C. Brown in his book, The Shariah, maintained that enslaved people actually retained fundamental human rights. We're talking about rights to physical protection, to marriage and unencumbered conjugal relationships, to limited property, and to religious observance. In the pure legal theory of the Shariah, an enslaved person functioned somewhat similarly to other dependent classes in society. It's almost like how we view minor children today in terms of legal dependency. The law explicitly commanded humane treatment, urging owners to literally feed and clothe slaves from their own personal provisions. Which leads us directly into section 3, the lived historical reality. Now, as any good historian will tell you, the laws on the books almost never match what's actually happening out on the streets. When we compare the Sharia ideals with historical practice, a massive gap emerges. The ideal was that the default state is freedom, right? Yet history shows us massive, multi-continental slave trades. The ideal dictated strict rights, yet shifting economic forces often dictated completely horrific treatment. The law very strictly prohibited the enslavement of free Muslims, yet there were rampant violations of this rule, usually driven by greed and local customs. The reality of riqq was frequently a vast, glaring contradiction of Islamic law itself. And this timeline brilliantly illustrates just how wildly diverse the lived reality of slavery was across the Islamic world. Look at the 1350s in West Africa. Enslaved people might be marginalized salt miners, or, surprisingly, they could be the sole agents of buying and selling in an entire city's vegetable market. Then, fast forward to the 1500s in Istanbul. The elite imperial guards and the absolute most powerful viziers of the Ottoman Empire were technically enslaved men. In the 1600s, you had Armenian imperial slaves serving the Safavid Shah. In the 1800s, the Indian Ocean Network relied on these incredibly complex servile labor roles. To call all of these completely different human experiences by one single word, slavery, shows just how much our modern language struggles to capture historical nuance. Now, as your history professor, I've got to point out the practice that is, frankly, the most fundamentally irreconcilable with our modern values. That is the established right, in historical Islamic law, of male owners to have sexual access to their female slaves. This is a stark, very uncomfortable contrast to our modern moral baseline, which is entirely founded on the primacy of consent. While legal caveats definitely existed regarding harm, the foundational permissibility of concubinage in the pre-modern era represents the sharpest edge of the moral conundrum we face today. Okay, let's turn to Section 4, the road to abolition. So how exactly does an institution that lasted for millennia finally end? Let's trace that historical transition. In the 1840s, we start seeing legal discourses shifting in Ottoman North Africa. They initially focused on the illegality of enslaving Black Muslims, but a massive catalyst occurred in the 1850s with the encounter with European abolitionism. This external pressure essentially forced Muslim clerics and scholars to deeply reevaluate their own legal heritage. By the 1870s, more radical anti-slavery approaches were emerging in places like British India, which eventually led to the integration of modern human rights frameworks in the 1900s. But here's the really crucial takeaway, guys. Muslim scholars didn't just blindly copy Western viewpoints. They developed powerful internal religious arguments for abolition. They argued that the Quran was always on a gradualist trajectory toward emancipation. They pointed out that the core of the shariah, with its constant urging to free slaves as charity or as legal expiation, basically always aimed at maximizing freedom. Therefore, ending slavery entirely wasn't a violation of Islam at all, but rather the ultimate fulfillment of the Prophet's original social reforms. And finally, Section 5, the modern conundrum. So how do we, sitting right here in the 21st century, reconcile an institution we view as an absolute irredeemable evil with revered historical and religious texts that clearly permitted it? This is the exact question author Jonathan A.C. Brown wrestled with. And what's fascinating is that he actually refined his approach to resolving this conundrum while teaching undergraduate students, just like you guys, in the spring of 2018. He realized that emotional reactions, while completely valid, don't actually help us understand the past. He saw the absolute necessity of using impartial academic analysis to understand historical moral frameworks without necessarily endorsing them. Modern academic criticism shows us something vital. Modern human rights discourse has fundamentally shifted the baseline of global morality. The massive economic and technological revolutions of the modern era allowed societies to finally survive without coerced labor, which in turn allowed a totally new moral consensus to form. We literally cannot just copy and paste our current ethical certainties onto the economic and social realities of the late antique Near East. Historical figures operated within the moral frameworks of their time, just as we operate within ours. I want to leave you off with a deeply provocative thought to end our class today. We look back at history with absolute moral certainty that they were wrong. But if we must so carefully historicize the moral authorities of the past, what currently accepted practices of ours will future historians find equally incomprehensible? What are we blindly doing today that the 24th century is going to look back on and view as an absolute moral evil? Think about that as you pack up your bags. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the past to better understand our present.